It says you've got, okay, I don't know what happened. It's different. Okay, Satnam everyone. This is Ekon Carr. I'm trying to do this experiment for a couple days of doing a live stream on breaking globalization, and now I'm going to check to see if, in fact, the live stream is working. So, okay, here we go. That is not working. I know nobody's here. I haven't sent out the link yet, so I'm just going to grab a different computer. Technical problems. Okay, and I can't get on this computer either. Okay, it looks like this is working. Okay, it looks like this is working, which I'm really grateful for. Okay, so I'm going to take a moment and just share the link in a couple places. I don't know that I expect anybody to watch, but this is, again, this is an experiment, and we're just going to post this in a few places. I think I'm still good. I think my live stream is still good. Yeah, good. Okay. All right. So, where am I? Where's my... Here we go. Okay, so, all right, we're about 4 minutes in, and I'm going to go ahead and do proper introduction. So my name is Ekon Carr Michaud, and this channel is called Restoration Economics, and it's kind of dedicated to the idea that we have to restore our relationships to the planet, our relationships to each other, in order to reinvigorate a prosperity that serves everyone. And I'll be doing other videos about kind of the background of where the term restoration economics comes from, and kind of my sort of flavor of how I'm approaching that topic. But today I actually wanted to just put some thoughts out there about this moment that we're in with the incredible tariffs that President Donald Trump just levied on the world, and why we're in this moment, and kind of what he's doing from my perspective, and what brought us to this, weird week we've lived through. So I want to go back to 1990. And when I was in college at Rice University, I was a student of Asian studies. And in 1989, there were student protests in China wanting more democracy, wanting more openness, wanting more inclusive voices. And some of you watching this may have never heard of the Tiananmen Square massacre, but the students were brutalized and killed by the Chinese government. And the world watched it, but within China, the memory of the student protest and the violence that shut it down has been largely erased. There's been a lot of propaganda from the Chinese government that the students were violent, and the Chinese government was protecting itself. So I'm sharing some pretty personal things here. So in 1990, I actually went abroad and studied in China from 1990 to 1991. And at the time, regular Chinese people would kind of come up to me and would say, "Hey, does the United States know what happened here? Do they know what happened to our students?" There would be people who would, talk to me about their children who went to these protests and never came home. Their fellow students were, invigorated by the memory that they had gotten together and protested, and then kind of also traumatized by what actually happened. So it was a very interesting moment to be there as a foreign student. And at the time, China was just kind of at the beginning stages of opening up more and more to the West. And they were interested in attracting business interests there. And I remember from my time in China, it was a big eye-opening experience, because when you grow up in the United States with the standard of living that we have here, you take everything for granted, whether it's the stores filled with things, whether it's, the cars on the road, everybody's got a car, whether it's, common plumbing. There's just so many things we grow up with here that have traditionally given us this incredibly high standard of living. And I was in a deep moment of learning, being in China, recognizing this is a country of 1 billion people, and the standard of living was just very, very different. At the time, most people rode bikes. There were very few cars on the road. Sometimes you would see, horses and carts. I would go to the library at the university where I was studying, and in our country, we go to a library. We go in, there's the books, we wander around, there's a catalog. You can look through the catalog, get books. In China at that time, all the books were locked behind cages, basically, and you didn't have access to an index card of any kind. You had to know what the book was that you wanted, go in, and there would be, one person behind a counter. And if you knew the book, you would ask for it, and then they would unlock the cage, go back to where all the books were, see if they had it, and come out and tell you. So there's just these deep differences in, a standard of living and approach to knowledge that I learned about when I was living in China. And the Chinese people were lovely people. Like, I loved the heart and the spirit of the Chinese people that I met there. Very artistic, very intelligent, very thoughtful. But it was just an experience of living under a communist government in, the year after Tiananmen Square. And like I said, when I talk about the standard of living, I mean, it's when you have a whole family living in a very small little room, from, a building that's like 600 or 700 years old, or there were big, skyscrapers, and You'd be put on a waiting list for years to have the opportunity to get an apartment. Um, it was just different. So to say that China was looking for investment capital is very real. They were looking, and rightly so, to find a way to raise the standard of living for the people in their country. And in 1992, in the United States, there was a presidential election, and Ross Perot ran for president, and he was kind of an industrialist, but he was an industrialist with who had kind of the workers in mind, because in the early 90s is when the United States was talking about NAFTA, the North American, free trade agreement, which meant they were going to break down barriers between Mexico and Canada and create more trade within, among these three countries. And Ross Perot ran for president with the attitude, we can't let NAFTA happen. The moment it does, you're going to hear this giant sucking sound where people, who have good jobs and good factories here in the United States are going to lose their jobs, and all of these factory jobs are going to go to Mexico. So, and Ross Perot was prescient that way, because once we started in the United States creating these global trade agreements, what happened is that companies based in the United States decided that it was cheaper to go produce products. It was cheaper for them to go overseas, produce the products, and then ship them back and sell them, well, not just in the United States, but sell them around the world, but sell them in the US. And so this was happening. And even though NAFTA was about, Mexico and Canada, this was also starting to happen in China. So when I would travel around China as a student, I would take the train to different places. And there were different kinds of classes you could get in. Anyway, hard seat is when you were just kind of on a wooden bench. Soft seat was like a more cushy, I don't know what you call it, compartment with, kind of cushions on the seats, basically. And there was one time I was traveling around, I was tired, and I just decided to splurge for the soft seat. And that's where, of course, if you got into soft seat kind of compartments, you were traveling with more well-to-do people, party officials or Communist Party officials or business people. And so on one of these train rides, I was talking to, and this is again 1990, 1991. I was talking to a man from the United States, and he was asking me questions, and I was telling him I was a foreign student and I was studying Chinese language and Chinese culture and how much I was enjoying the country and traveling around, and it was wonderful. My year in China was one of the best years of my life. It opened my mind. It changed my perspective. It was such a deep education. But I remember this man saying to me, well, you're young and that's great that you're getting to do all these things, but I'm a businessman and I'm just here, to make money, basically. I'm just here to make money. I'm just here for the business. And, when I was at school there in China, they took us for, the foreign students weren't allowed to live with the Chinese students. We had our own separate dormitory. So anyone studying at the university from abroad, we had to stay in our own place. They didn't want us living with the Chinese students. They didn't want the Chinese students living with us. There was a joke that, they didn't want the Chinese students to be infected by Western ideas. My roommate was Japanese. We had, the woman down the hall was from France. There were folks from Senegal, Cameroon, and Africa. So even, and also way back in the 1990s, the Chinese government was trying to build relationships with African students, would invite them over, give them scholarships, and get them to learn Chinese so that they could in time do business with Africa. So one day we were all shown, an ideal. We were kind of taken around to the ideal Chinese model village and the ideal Chinese factory, and we went into this factory where women were making jackets, and this was an ideal factory in 1990 in China, but it wouldn't have passed safety standards in the United States. Like it was an ideal factory for them, and it wasn't. From my perspective, from a US citizen's perspective, it wasn't the best working conditions, even at the ideal factory. So I remember saying to my Chinese professor who was with me, I was like, there were signs on the wall that said, don't talk to each other, time is money, basically like you're not allowed to stop and have a conversation with your friend, like stay focused on your work. And I turned to my professor and I was like, this isn't Marxism. I mean, this is not Marxist thought on the walls. And he was like, shut up, don't say anything. So there's this moment when trade started opening up, and the United States, had gone through a really powerful movement of unionization because, when industrialization started happening in the United States, the factory conditions were horrible. The working conditions were horrible. Children were working. They were getting paid terribly. It's not like the glory days of the factory jobs that people are wanting to get back to is where the US started. The US started in very exploitative, factory conditions. And then through unionization, through strikes, through protests, eventually over time, the US gained these, labor laws, gained safety regulations, gained good pay for these factory jobs. And when there was the opportunity to go to other countries where labor was cheap, where safety conditions were not going to be as stringent, and frankly, where businesses could skirt the environmental regulations that had gotten put in place in the US in the 70s, the business interests took that bet and made a decision to relocate factories in these other countries. And, the Chinese workers weren't going to organize and strike. The workers in Mexico weren't going to organize and strike because they were looking to raise their standard of living. And so we started to develop this economy, which is come to be known as globalization, where things are built in these countries that don't have the same safety regulations, don't have the same labor requirements, don't have, the same wage expectations as what was in the US. And that began this hollowing out of US manufacturing. So who benefited from that? Well, the owners benefited, and owners being founders and owners being stockholders, right? So in the US, if you're a publicly traded company, yeah, okay, so your owners are your stockholders. And, around, this time, companies didn't want to offer pensions anymore, right? Because when you started to offer pensions to your employees, you were paying them money till they died, even though they had stopped working for you years ago. So there became this push, oh, we don't want to do pensions anymore. We want 401ks. 401ks, let's incentivize that. Let's incentivize people to become part of the stock owning class by saying your retirement is based on your ability to purchase stocks and manage stocks, not on the company's obligation to say you've worked for us for 25 years and we're going to pay you and your wife a pension until you and your wife are gone, right? So the corporate culture also changed. There wasn't going to be retirement through commitment and longevity to a company. There were going to be tax incentives for people who earned money to save through investing in stocks. Okay. So there's this split that starts to happen in terms of economic fortunes in the 1990s that globalization brings about. And the split is the really good manufacturing jobs, which are there for people. There was a much less smaller percentage of the U.S. population that went to college back then. I mean, in my time, it was growing, but like in my mother's time or my dad's time, you didn't need a college education to make a good living. You just didn't. But what happened is that blue collar jobs, manufacturing jobs disappeared overseas to countries that were where the workers are going to earn a lot less. There wasn't going to be environmental regulation and there wasn't going to be safety regulations. Meanwhile, a professional class started developing along the college educated, and they were being incentivized to save for their retirement through the stock market, which meant they were becoming part of the owner class that was economically benefiting from sort of cheap goods made in these conditions being sold on a global market. Now, Apple is one of the biggest, poster childs for this experience, because in 1984 they opened a manufacturing center in California, and the people there were making union wages and they were making a good living. And then in 1990 they closed it and they started shifting their manufacturing overseas. And there was a documentary done years and years and years ago, and there was a woman living on the streets in California. She was homeless, and she remembered the days of working at this factory at Apple and making a decent living. Meanwhile, by 2010 in China, Apple's manufacturing partners, there were 14 people who committed suicide at one of the factories there because the factory conditions were so horrible. They were working 16-hour days. They were never allowed to leave the factory floor. They were exhausted. And because China is not a country where you can organize, and protest, there wasn't a voice to get this addressed. And Apple came under a certain amount of scrutiny, and they said, well, we're dealing with it, but there's no transparency there. See, one of the problems with a closed society is there's never transparency. And so people can go behind closed doors and come out and say whatever the hell they want, and there's no way to check it. So the great wealth that Apple created for itself through these amazing products and innovative marketing was also on the back of this system that, on the one hand, brought wealth to China, but on the other hand, was not necessarily, it wasn't in the values that like the unions had fought for in this country. And I always found it, as a student, I'm just a student of language, culture, history. I'm a big student. So as a student, I always found it remarkably ironic that the People's Republic of China, which was, it was a revolution based on workers' rights, based on, shared prosperity, based on all these things. Actually, the United States had way better rights for workers than China ever has, in terms of like the 5-day week, in terms of safety regulations. Everyone talks about communist China. It's like, no, actually, the U.S. was a better environment for workers than China had for their average workers. And we got that through the ability to organize, through protest, through democracy, through elected representatives. And what I remember from the 1990s is this. I remember the wisdom was, we're going to open up China to business, and they're going to become more democratic as a result of it. But now, 30 some years later, the opposite has happened. U.S. businessmen started doing business in China, and our culture has turned more towards authoritarianism, because there is something very elegant about a central committee creating a plan for the whole country, and not having to listen to lots of different voices, and not having to navigate special interests, and just like being efficient and making decision and setting directions. And it's all about the relationships. And yeah, bribery is part of it. So what? Big deal. Bribery is part of it. Democracy is messy, and it takes time, and it's not efficient because you have to listen to everyone, and you have to get everyone's input, and you've got to argue, and you've got to fight, and you've got to come up with a compromise, and there's always somebody not happy with the compromise, and they're going to come back 5 years later. I mean, it's messy, but it has actually done a better job, at least earlier in the 20th century, of securing working conditions, fair wages, those kinds of things for the average worker. Okay. So now here we are 30 years later, 35 years later. And I was, I've been back to China a couple times, since I lived there. And there was one particular trip I took in 2018. And I was in Beijing. And the Beijing of 2018 was very different than the Beijing of 1990. And I remember walking around the streets of Beijing saying, wow, this is where the American middle class is now. They had totally become middle class. Like, that feeling of lack and poverty was not there. There were gorgeous statues being built in a beautiful public park. There were people walking around with their designer T-shirts and their designer handbags and their designer jeans. And I was like, oh, so the money that was fueled to China to pay for manufacturing there did lift up. I don't know about everybody, but it definitely lifted up a lot of boats in China and kind of brought prosperity to China. So the thing that gets lost, right, is that everyone wants to make this about Donald Trump and MAGA, and then on the MAGA people are like, well, the liberal Democrats, and this polarization and othering that's happening, where everyone's othering each other, is obscuring a very real economic issue that has never gotten solved, which is the fact that globalization created winners and losers within the United States. Everybody did not win through globalization. The college educated won more than anyone else, probably. Stockholders won. But regular people who had this economic base of manufacturing to provide for themselves, provide for their families. I mean, back then, you could have a house, you could have a vacation house, have a decent living, and there was maybe a pension on the other side of it. There was a good life for people who weren't ever necessarily going to become super educated or super elite, right? And what Donald Trump tuned into was that exasperated rage and frustration. And I will tell you, in my lifetime, this issue has never made it into the national discourse in an intelligent way. It has never made it into Congress to be debated and legislated in an intelligent way. On the opposite, we have the most abysmal. Like, when I was in my 20s, the minimum wage was $5 and something. 30 years later, the minimum wage is $7.25 or something like that. It is insane that the minimum wage is essentially slave labor now in the US. You can't live on it. And so it was like, we're going to take away your jobs and we're not going to raise the minimum wage. And so now you have these parts of the United States that are just economically broken. And people are furious. Their jobs went overseas. Yeah. Our jobs went to people that you could pay a lot less to. Yeah. And 35 years is almost 2 generations of this economic change. So back, so there's a lot of vilification going on, and people try and keep this conversation in the freak out, they're evil mode. I mean, everybody's calling each other evil. I mean, everyone is. The left is calling MAGA evil. MAGA is calling the left evil. I mean, everyone's calling each other evil. This is not about evil. This is about the flow of energy around the world. And this is about the fact that globalization created winners and losers in the United States. And the losers have never, ever, ever had their concerns seriously addressed. So during the first Trump administration, and I remember reading stories about this, Trump tried to get a roundtable together. He's like, okay, Steve Bannon, this is your flag you're waving about globalization. Okay, business leaders from the US, sit down at the table, figure something out. So Trump in his first term looked for, rightly or wrongly, some kind of dialogue across these different interests to figure it out and work it out. And the business people were like, look, those days are never coming back. We've got robots now. Even if we were to bring back manufacturing here, a lot of it would be robotics anyway. It's not going to happen. In other words, the business interests, once they found this other way to produce, their loyalty was to their stockholders, and it was never to the workers on any continent, frankly. The conditions of the Chinese workers weren't their problem in a way. The conditions of the workers in Mexico weren't their problem. And the fact that they weren't giving jobs to workers in the United States wasn't their problem. So, so the first Trump administration, okay, you did some tariffs, it hurt the farmers, because the other part of globalization is the way that we feed the world, right? We have farms, they produce food. There's no way the US consumers are going to eat as much food as we can produce. It is a commodity we can export and, trade it to China, send it out through US aid, so farmers got hurt the first time around, but no manufacturing came back to the United States the first time around. So now Trump's gotten reelected. And, I'm not going to deny that the current Republican Party seems to be abandoning democratic principles left and right. Okay, fine. I get that. But just because they're abandoning democratic principles doesn't mean there isn't a legitimate issue behind all this. And the legitimate issue is the winners and losers from globalization. So now Trump has power. He also has immunity because the Supreme Court gave him basically immunity. Like, hey, if you're doing something in your role as the president, you can't be held personally, criminally liable for it. And his administration is now testing every boundary it can to see how much power the executive can grab from Congress and from the judiciary. But they're doing it to enact an agenda. And the agenda, and I get it, Christian nationalism is an issue, and we can talk about that another day. But the real issue is the people who have lost economically for the last 35 years. And so now, this issue has never been consciously debated and discussed. If the Democrats had brought up this issue anytime in the last 10 years and tried to legislate around it, it would be a different political playing field, in my view. And so now there is no other choice, probably from their perspective, except to just break globalization. We're just going to break it. The tariffs, as much as people are talking about the tariffs being on other countries, the reality is, in my view, the tariffs are a way to punch back at the business interests that have abandoned US workers. It is now going to be impossible for your bottom line to manufacture outside the United States. it's now going to be impossible for your bottom line to create this global, journey where products are made and, you're paying low wages and, the environment isn't, anyway, the environment's a different issue. And I know Trump doesn't care about the environment, but I care about the environment. But it's going to be impossible for you now to profit from a system that takes advantage of cheap labor in other countries and then comes back and sells in the United States. So Trump is, in my view, it's like this pain is real, and it has been real for 20, 30 years. This political pain has never made it into the national conscience in terms of a dialogue and a conversation and legislation. And now what Trump is doing is he's blowing up global trade, not because he's in bed with Putin, not because he, I don't know. There's lots of things out there. Okay, I'm not saying Putin doesn't have an influence on him, but all of the motives we're ascribing to Trump is a way to avoid the freaking issue that has been underneath this for decades, which is you left a bunch of people in the United States behind when you started manufacturing overseas, and we have never, ever addressed it. So Trump comes along, and he's a strong man kind of personality, and his people love him for that. He's going to solve the globalization once and for all, the issue once and for all. First term, he tried to get the business people to talk about it with Bannon and his friends. They didn't come up with anything. Well, now we're just going to break it. Now you're not going to be able to work that way anymore. And what are you going to do? I don't agree that these extreme tariffs are going to bring manufacturing back to the United States. I think it is a fundamentally flawed approach. But what it is doing is creating so much pain among stockholders and kind of the ownership class that there's no way to know what the future economic world order is going to be. And I also think that the Trump administration is trying to lay the groundwork to entice manufacturing back here. I think getting rid of people protecting the national parks. I think Trump's ultimate goal is, with his cabal that surrounds him, is to not preserve the parks, but to sell resources on these lands to business interests so they can exploit the environment here, and maybe that will bring something back. I think it's ridiculous as the Greenland thing is. What you have to understand is one of the reasons companies like Apple relocated to China is because they have the rare earth minerals that are required for computing technology. And so if you're saying, well, we're gonna break that relationship, we're not going to manufacture in China anymore, where are you going to get your rare earth minerals? Oh, Greenland. Greenland has them somewhere really close to us. So when you start to understand the agenda of globalization and the agenda to break globalization, these things don't look insane anymore. I might deeply, deeply, deeply disagree with the strategy, but it's not just evil and it's not just insane. There's a very real economic force behind what's happening. And the problem is that the media spheres are so fractured and so split that we can't see each other anymore as Americans. And that's the problem. We don't see each other anymore because there's not a common place of understanding. There's not a common place of dialogue. And everyone is into hyper emotionalism, because that's what gets clicks. If I freak you out, you'll click on what I'm saying. So I just wanted to give those thoughts from my own experience growing up, being in college in the 90s and studying in China, and then watching things that have happened. And what I would offer to my friends who are liberal, who may watch this, is I would like you to get out of your hyperreactivity to Trump and recognize part of what's, all of the people in this country who've decided to give him magical powers to try and solve this issue that's been plaguing us for 35 years, and maybe put your brilliant thinking caps on and understand that issue and how can we come up with solutions and legislate it, because the way he's handling it, I don't think is going to work, but the issue has to be addressed. And I'd like all of my conservative friends who may be listening to this to meditate on what it means to bring back manufacturing to the United States without saying we have to roll back environmental regulations. We've got to keep wages low in order for it to work. Because human dignity matters and environmental stewardship matters. And I feel like a lot of business interests left the US because we had this regulatory system that took care of people and took care of the environment. And I don't want to see reshoring of manufacturing in a way that is going to destroy the environment and take us back to the days of, no safety regulations, child labor, and all those things that generations of workers fought to get out of. Okay, so I don't think anyone is watching this, but this is my first live stream, and I'm going to hope to do more of these in the future. I'm going to put this up on my YouTube channel, and if you run across it, I hope it's useful. Please subscribe, like the video, please subscribe, and thanks, and have a great day.